Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar comic review. This one's going to be for Avatar The Last Airbender Imbalance Part 1. This book is out today, Tuesday, December 18th. Everywhere. It's available digitally, physically. The comic book store release date for this book is actually tomorrow. So this seems to be something that Dark Horse is now doing going forward, that the digital release of the book is now on the same day as the physical release. So this is going to be a big positive going forward in that more people are going to be able to read the book during the initial hype period and the whole weird, it's released in comic book stores, wait 13 days, then more people can read it. That's always been such a kind of frustrating thing in terms of the discussion around these books. That seems to be a kind of thing of the past now. So hopefully they keep that up. It seems to be the case with Imbalance Part 2, which was recently delayed until May. But it seems to be the same kind of Tuesday release date and all that sort of stuff. So that makes it easier because, as I said, the book is available digitally as well. You could have picked this up Monday midnight if you really wanted to. But yeah, my physical copy arrived today and I have read it. This is going to be more of a kind of initial reaction type one rather than like heavy analysis, because I haven't had a ton of time to like read through it multiple times. So this is just an initial reaction video. I'll still go full spoiler, so if you haven't read the book yet, this perhaps isn't the video for you. But I'll do my best to describe my initial thoughts and what actually happens. So where I stand on this as the return of Avatar comics after a bit of a break, you know, all of Turf Wars happened. Turf Wars was released over a very long time period, and we didn't get any Avatar comics in the middle of that. So it's been a good, year and a half plus since the last Avatar comic. We are back with a new creative team of Faith Erin Hicks and Peter Wortman. Peter Wortman is the artist, Faith Erin Hicks on writing. Colors by Ryan Hill, letters by Richard Starkings, and Comic Craft's Jimmy Betancourt. And what I'll say is that, like, overall, from a technical standpoint, I think the art is really good. I really like Peter Wortman's art. Ryan Hill's coloring is really good as well. I think the writing is also very good. I think Faith Erin Hicks captures the characters really well, and we already knew that from her work on the Free Comic Shells, and we know she's a really big fan of the show, so that was, I think, never really in doubt. But actually reading it here, it's very clear. She gets the characters, she knows how each of the members of Team Avatar are meant to interact, and I think she writes a lot of the other characters who are maybe more comic specific, like Satoru, really well, and so on. I think for me, the only problem that I have with this book is what I expected the problem to be pretty much as soon as the book was announced, and that is that was the non-bender plot point that is the focus of this book going to be particularly like eventful, meaningful, impactful. And while yes, they are trying to make a lot of connections to get us from ATLA to Korra in terms of setting up this non-bender issue, and in some cases those connections are quite nice, I think it suffers a little bit from the fact that it is just filling in a blank, and that we know there's only so far they can go with this because we know it remains a problem. We know the bender non-bender issue remains an issue all the way up to Korra. A couple of things change in that one of the key missing things that we don't have yet in Imbalance, but we do have in Korra, is the metal bending police force. And the other thing that we don't have here, but that we do have in Korra again, is the triads. But you can see the sort of path for both of those things to come into play, and they're going to be cool moments when and potentially if they happen in this book. But where are the big, like, different moments that we were expecting? Where's the character development? Because right now it doesn't necessarily feel like there's any one individual character who's like a focus right now. Aang as the Avatar, of course, is dealing with this conflict. Katara is always there to support Aang and also offer her own advice in what's going on. Toph is a little bit more heavily linked here because, of course, her father is one of the leaders of Cranefish Town by virtue of being one of the main businessmen. And then Sokka, while I wouldn't say he is particularly important in part one, feels a little bit more important because he's offering that non-bender perspective on Team Avatar, and that's like a conflict that we're getting into here. They haven't committed really to him really forming too much of an opinion right now, but he's giving, I suppose, Aang and the others who are maybe not used to seeing anti-bender sentiment context to maybe why that is indeed something that people would feel. So it's all well written in that I don't think there's any like problem. I don't think there's any negative towards anything that really happens in this book. The only issue that, as I said, is just that I don't feel that there's any big moments. I don't think there's anything huge to discuss in the aftermath of Imbalance Part 1. And I think that's been a problem with the comics for a while, in that, for me, I'd go all the way back to Smoke and Shadow Part 3 for the last time I think we've had a truly discussion-heavy moment that's happened in the comics. Something that has really advanced a character forward, created a whole different, aspect of discussion towards them. And you guys probably know what it is if you watched my videos before, but for anyone unaware, it's this scene from Smoke and Shadow Part 3. Zuko and Azula fighting in the crypt, and basically the shift of Azula's character from wanting to be the Fire Lord herself to accepting that that's not her destiny. Even that in itself is interesting, but it's the way she then interprets what she actually has to do. Instead of maybe the path you'd expect her to take, which is maybe turning things around, she thinks that, no, she needs to like manipulate things so that Zuko is forced to basically become the Fire Lord like she would have been, but it's not her, it's him instead, because she now accepts Zuko has to be the Fire Lord, but she's going to make his personality, the way he rules, into the way she thinks it should be ruled. And that's interesting because we don't know where Azula goes. We know nothing about Azula from Korra. We never get any hint about like if she lives, dies, has a family, anything that happens. And because of that, anything notable that to do with Azula as a character is suddenly hugely, hugely impactful. And I think that's why I always go back to Smoke and Shadow for that's the last time I felt that we got something really big in the comics. There's been nice moments since then, of course. Hakoda and Katara, when Aang arrives back in North and South was a very nice moment. But that was very much more of a just, fun, cute character moment, rather than, I think, a really discussion-heavy thing in terms of... I have to treat these comics as... we get one a year. We get a collection of basically 3 comics over the course of a year that make up one full story. And North and the South, I don't think was all that impactful in terms of what it offered. Turf Wars, I think, was very dull in terms of anything of note. And while I think there's more here because they do add some nuance to the bender non-bender issue. The villain is actually so much more interesting than Tokuga from Turf Wars, and I'll talk about her in a minute. And I think because of that, I will praise this book more than all the parts of Turf Wars and some aspects of North and South. I think this has potential, come the end, part 2 and 3 included, to get to the point where I think it's maybe like Smoke and Shadow, because I understand how some people maybe found the first parts of Smoke and Shadow to be a little maybe lacking in those big moments, and it took until part 3 and Azula's introduction to make that into something really big. I think with this it's probably going to take until the end and us getting the full details on what exact connections they're trying to make here, because I think the thing that I'm thinking about throughout all of this is that we're still very, very close to the end of ATLA. The comics haven't covered that much time at all in the grand scheme of things. Given that The Promise starts a year on after the end of the series, like in my opinion, only about a year and a half or so has actually passed during the course of all the comics. To me, Aang is only about 15 and a half, maybe 15 and 3/4. At an absolute stretch, I would give you that he's 16, but I don't quite see where that time comes from based on everything that we get. And because of that, I feel like we're still a little too early to make too heavy of a connection to get to Korra. Like, if the triads are introduced right now, it feels like, okay, that's a little on the nose. If they go straight into Metalbender Police Force right now, is that a little too fast, too soon? But at the same time, they have to keep the characters this young because there are still ongoing plot points, like the Azula thing. The way the Azula plot leaves off at the end of Smoke and Shadow, they can't just skip ahead 3 years and be like, oh yeah, Azula's still out there terrorizing the Fire Nation, we just haven't dealt with her in all that time. There comes a point where you're going to have to be like, okay, look, the Azula stuff has to happen first, and then we can maybe do a time skip. But that's just that kind of point. So what I'm going to make clear here is that I think this is a really well-constructed book. I think hardcore Avatar fans will like this, but I don't think that this is necessarily the comic that is going to get the people who kind of dropped off the comics in or around the Rift, maybe going into Smoke and Shadow. I don't think this is going to get them back in because it doesn't have those big moments like The Search has, like The Promise even has as the first comic, and then the spiritual stuff and stuff like that in The Rift made that impactful. The Azula appearance in Smoke and Shadow made that interesting. Even the start of North and South had the return to the South as a major plot point. This is trying to sell itself on the basis of the Bender-non-Bender conflict. And that is a notable plot point. That is something that interests fans. But how interested are you on the very start of it, given that you basically know where it goes? And I think that's what this book is always struggling against to a degree. That can it do anything truly big? And it makes sense how it wasn't mentioned that there was like a war, like like 60 years ago or something like that between benders and non-benders, that sort of thing. So there's some stuff where they're sort of limited in what they can do here, but I do like some of the connections that they're trying to make, and that I do feel with Toph in this book, they're basically getting her to the point where, like, I think they'll have to set up the idea of she's sort of being ignored as the executive partner of the Earth and Fire Refinery. Her father's not really including her on a lot of the business stuff. He mainly wants to talk to Aang about that. So I can definitely see her just like abandoning the business stuff and just deciding that, okay, the problem that needs to be solved in Cranefish Town is security. We need a police force. I'll do it. I'm training metal benders, and because I have a certain amount of control over, how we find metal benders and control over the teaching of it, I can make it so that, it's this sort of exclusive ability that, I can see them doing something like that. They don't touch on it in this book, but Toph feels like very removed from the business aspect, and they have to, I think, do something with that. And I think all that they've set up in the comics for Toph leads towards the pieces are all there for Toph to begin, the Metalbender police force, basically. Similarly, on the back cover, you get this nice moment of Aang and Katara looking on at Cranefish Town, which means they're on Air Temple Island. And we get that moment. And I think that's probably my favorite scene in the book, is Aang, frustrated by a lot of what he's seeing here, having to deal with all of these issues, his first time really seeing anti-Bender sentiment, frustrated with how some of the non-benders are not accepting help when they're just honestly trying to help. He asks Katara to kind of fly with him on Appa to just talk, and so they just go off to the Air Temple Island on their own, and they have this nice talk about just Aang's frustration. He basically airs his frustrations to Katara about, he feels that this place isn't necessarily progress, it's just chaos that's what's happening here. And Katara gives him, hope that they're beginning to listen to you already with the plan about the police force. Give it time and that could absolutely be the case. And I like how he kind of settles on the fact that, he says, but maybe there's still time to help this city grow in a way that protects and preserves. Because the other thing with Aang in all of this is that where Cranefish Town is significant to him, because the Earth and Fire Refinery was built on top of the sacred land to Lady Tianhai, the connection to the Airbenders, and he sort of accepted that for the sake of that book. But now suddenly he's seeing all this extra land, complete modernization, and just no sense of the sort of spiritual kind of respect type stuff. But he's still maintaining hope, and I like that because Katara kind of really helps to kind of bring him back on board here. And it feels like in this scene that we're getting to that point, that it's Aang acknowledging the fact that he's going to have to be around this city a lot as it grows. It's him almost accepting the fact that, like, is his time, like, traveling around the world as much as he has already kind of, coming to an end. He's still going to travel, of course, but he kind of needs his base of operations to be near Cranefish because of what it means, what it represents. Because it represents the new era, he has to be nearby it. And so I hope Imbalance is the book that really starts Air Temple Island. I think Aang needs a base of operations. He's already started the Air Acolytes, so they sort of also need a central location, given that I think it's... I think it makes more sense for them to potentially like start with a new Air Temple rather than just trying to repopulate the old ones at this point. So I think Air Temple Island makes sense for that, and given that Katara and Aang talk, I feel like it's also, if Aang has to, settle down somewhere, does he ask Katara to stay with him, and how does that go in terms of their relationship? I think there's a potentially really nice big moment on the line there. But that's some of those connection moments. Let's get into, I suppose, talking about the non-bender issue. The core of it is that since we were last here, the Earth and Fire Refinery used to have these two lines. It used to have a non-bender line that was basically automated and was run by people who ran the machines, and then they had a bender line which was run by benders. And at the time, I believe they said that the bender line was the slightly more efficient one, but that the technology was growing. They come back here, and the technology has completely outpaced bending to the point where benders have lost their jobs, and this is not just in the Earth and Fire Refinery, this is happening across basically all of the factories. So benders are losing their jobs to machines is basically what they're getting at here. And because of that, they're sort of angry, frustrated out on the streets, causing issues, and that's causing an issue for non-benders. And so the proposal from Lau at the Council of Businessmen that he invites Aang to is, should we ban bending on the streets? That's the proposal. That just flat out, you cannot, if you are a bender, bend out in public on the streets. Aang initially is kind of shocked by this, even though, like, I suppose to a degree, depending on how you really feel about the subject, I suppose you can be like, that seems reasonable, or, yeah, that's a bit much. The idea, I suppose, that Aang kind of counters with in the end, after getting over the initial frustration, is that no, what this town actually needs is a police force. It needs a group that is able to basically be there on the streets and sort of, I suppose, interpret if benders bending on the streets is actually a crime or not, rather than just benders flat out can't bend at any point whatsoever. And they're creating some nuance here, because the idea, more or less, is that, I suppose what they're trying to get at is like that, are benders too focused on their abilities and maybe not developing other skills? Or is the progress with non-benders and then focusing on technology, are they sort of excluding benders from getting in on this stuff, even though they could actually do the same jobs as non-benders, and they're being excluded just because they have their abilities? And then obviously the other side of it is that the benders then, because they have the power, are able to sort of really put non-benders in a bad situation. And that's what we see in one of the first sections of the book, where there's a brawl between a group of earthbenders and a group of firebenders, which results in some houses being knocked down, and Aang and Toph want to fix them, but the owners of the houses refuse the help, just flat out. We do not want you to rebuild a house for us. Even though Aang and Toph basically say they can do it in like minutes. They can have them a better house than they had initially built like in seconds. They still refuse just because they don't want to accept help from benders. So people setting their, they're standing on their hill. They're really doubling down on their opinions about benders versus non-benders. The villain comes into play at the Council of Meetings, and that when Aang proposes the idea that there should be some sort of a like police security force, this woman called Li Ling steps up, and she reveals that she runs a security force. They're men and women, all of them are benders, and she can basically fulfill this role. And it seems like, okay, she's honestly trying to help, but then as she goes on speaking, she begins to, kind of placate Aang a little bit too much. Mentions him as the avatar, his wisdom, true leadership, and stuff like that. We're gonna try and make it fair to everyone. But the entire time she's speaking, you definitely start to get this sense, especially like up here, like we believe in you, Avatar, that she is not telling the full truth here. But everyone eventually agrees to this. And what ends up happening is that suddenly here is this Bender security company in charge of the security of the entire town. And given that, what they're basically trying to say here is that, like, the Benders, in terms of their grievances, are the ones who are the most sort of, like, aggressive because, they've lost their jobs over what's happened. And because of that, there's almost this sense of, like, what is Li Ling going to do now that she has this power? And immediately what happens, the big kind of action set piece that takes place in the book, is that her daughters, who are both Benders, she sends them out to basically hire, I think it's the Firebender thugs from earlier on in the book, to sabotage the Earth and Fire refinery. And we see a big explosion takes place at the factory. Toph is nearly killed, but of course, defends herself, blocks it with a big, piece of metal. They chase the saboteurs away, and we find out that Li Ling's daughters, under her orders, were meant to get rid of all the evidence. And if that meant that the guys were about to be captured, kill them. And what happens is that Aang actually captures one of the guys on a cliff, but the Earthbender girl basically collapses the cliff. And this guy's about to die from falling off this cliff, but because Aang's an airbender, he manages to save him. So they have this sort of guy as this piece of evidence that could be the key to, I suppose, Aang realizing the truth about Li Ling. And they go back to her and explain what happened, but she basically is like, okay, that's not the best thing to happen. But we end the book with the idea that plans are now in motion. Not even the Avatar will be able to stop them. As basically the idea seems to be that, like, she's trying to make things better for her own family and Benders by sabotaging all of the factories that use, like, automated machinery, which potentially will get Benders their jobs back, or just will take out non-Bender factories and will allow, I suppose, more people to hire Benders, or something like that. I think there's still a little bit more depth to go into it, Li Ling, but overall, just fascinating, just because she is this, like, businesswoman, and she has a security firm, she has these two daughters, and you get sort of where she's going from, in that it seems like it's maybe a sort of a Tarlok-esque type thing here, where, where there's issue between non-Benders and Benders, you'd initially think that, okay, it's of course the non-Benders suffering from what Benders are doing, but she's presenting, like, the opposite perspective, and is going as far as to sort of be a little bit anti-non-Bender. So what's going on there? Again, it's one of those ones I need to read the book more, a couple more times to get the full nuance of what's going on there. But I think there's the potential here for an interesting villain. And again, the whole idea of this seems to solve the problem. Here is our new police force. Why did the Metalbender police force come into play? Obviously something happens with her. She's found out. She's taken out of the role. Maybe that's when Toph steps up with the proposal that Metalbenders would make the best police officers and so on. So that's interesting. With regards to Suki, she doesn't appear in this book, but we do get a scene somewhere in the middle where Sokka says that he's going to call Suki to come to them. Because obviously they were on their way to see her in the first place. Now they're calling her into play here. So hopefully in part 2, Suki makes an appearance. I think that would actually add something to the story. She's a character that fans have sort of been... there's been a little bit of a movement, I suppose, within the fandom to sort of get Suki the respect that she deserves. She's a member of Team Avatar. Why is she so often excluded from the team? In merchandise, where they often do, like, one of each member of the team, each member of the main cast, she's pretty much left out until, down the road they eventually do her. Similarly in the comics here, have we just forgotten in the aftermath of this that she's like Sokka's girlfriend as well as being a member of the team? So there's that. But yeah, they're my initial thoughts on the book. I'll have another more in-depth video towards the end of the week, probably Thursday or Friday. Then on Sunday, we have the big podcast review where we're going to go through the book page by page, analyzing everything. So over the course of this week, you are going to get a ton of content from me on Imbalance. For now, this has been my initial reaction to the book. Again, I think it's solid. I think it's really overall solid. It is a good book. I think you should read it. You should check it out. It just doesn't have the big moments like some of the comics from the past have had. And I think it's just a bit frustrating to know that the comics can do stuff like The Search, do stuff like The Promise, The Rift, aspects of Smoke and Shadow. But we haven't had necessarily that in a while. I think there's potential. As I said, the art is good, the writing is solid. We could get there. It's just how long we're going to be waiting. For me, like, Turf Wars didn't have a lot of substance to it. North and South, in the end, didn't have a lot of substance to it, but there were some fun moments early on. What way is this going to go? So, there are my initial thoughts on Imbalance, Part 1. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are if you've read the book. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.